corporation. Under the heat of Capitol lights, Musk exploded in rage, slamming the table. But Crockett didn't flinch. Then she said one sentence, and the world watched Elon Musk fall silent. What did she say that brought America's most powerful man to his knees? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. 9 a.m. Room 214, Capitol Hill. The air inside the hearing chamber was thick with anticipation, camera shutters clicking like distant gunfire. Every seat was taken. Lining the walls were rows of journalists from the New York Times, BBC, Al Jazeera, and dozens of outlets streaming live to a nation desperate for answers. Outside, protesters held signs that read, "Where's the money?" and "Stop funding ghost tech." Inside, beneath the vaulted ceiling and beneath the blinding lights, the name Elon Musk hovered in every whisper and every gaze like a loaded weapon. The National Audit Office had just released a bombshell report. $12.2 billion in taxpayer funds allocated for technological modernization had vanished from federal ledgers without explanation. The name at the center of the financial black hole? Elon Musk. Through a tangled web of shell companies, venture proxies, and AI infrastructure licenses, his company Neurocore Capital had become the nexus of one of the largest financial disappearances in U.S. public funding history. But today was not just about finance. It was about accountability on national television. Enter Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, draped in navy blue, expression carved from stone. She didn't smile, didn't wave. She walked with the kind of silence that makes powerful men nervous. As chair of the House Subcommittee on Public Funds and Budget Integrity, Crockett wasn't just here to ask questions. She was here to draw blood, and the room knew it. Even the Republican members, who once dismissed her as too theatrical, now leaned forward, silent, because the math didn't lie. Billions were gone. Public schools had missed upgrades. Children in rural clinics lacked tablets and internet. And yet Musk's portfolio soared. The injustice wasn't abstract. It had faces, names, lost futures. This wasn't a hearing. This was the beginning of a reckoning, and Jasmine Crockett was holding the match. And then he entered, not as a man summoned by Congress, but as a figure who believed he still controlled the room. Elon Musk, the name that built rockets, ruled stock markets, and stirred both awe and fear in millions, walked through the tall double doors of room 214 like he was stepping onto a TED stage. The hush that fell over the room wasn't respect. It was tension. The kind that coils around your spine when power arrives in tailored arrogance. His charcoal gray suit, crisply pressed, shimmered faintly under the recessed lighting. The sunglasses stayed on longer than necessary, a barrier between him and the weight of scrutiny. When he finally took them off and placed them beside the mic, he revealed a gaze not flustered, not uncertain, but rehearsed, hard, unblinking, rehearsed. He sat, adjusted his cufflinks with the indifference of a man whose world had never truly been questioned. The chair creaked beneath him, but he didn't seem to notice. Then, without waiting for a formal cue, without acknowledging the gravity of the $12.2 billion disappearance at the center of the room, Musk leaned into the microphone with a practiced ease, eyes flicking toward the cameras like a performer finding his light. His voice, low, calm, almost smug, cut through the silence. "I didn't take the money, I turned it into solutions." The line echoed, calculated, curated for soundbite. And for a split second it worked. A few chuckles rippled through the back benches. Half-formed grins appeared on faces that didn't yet know where this was going. A Republican aide scribbled something approving, but across the aisle Jasmine Crockett didn't move. No blink, no reply, no reaction. Just a stillness that felt like a fuse had been lit under the table. With the precision of someone who had been waiting for this moment longer than the world had been watching, Crockett tapped her screen. Behind her, a massive LED panel lit up. No graphs, no charts, no legal jargon. Just 5 words centered in black serif type, cold and precise. Turned money into promises, then turned promises into smoke. There was no music, no drama in the delivery, just facts dressed in minimalist brutality. And yet it landed with the force of an indictment. The smirks disappeared. A producer in the press box audibly muttered, "Oh, damn." Even Musk's posture changed, just slightly. It was a moment measured in heartbeats and held breaths. Not because Crockett had shouted, not because she'd raised a single accusatory finger, but because she had done the one thing that technocrats and billionaires feared most. She'd stripped away the armor of complexity and spoken a language too simple to distort. There it was. Not an accusation, a truth, boiled down to its cruelest, clearest form. Every camera lens now pointed to her. Every eye in the room left him. Elon Musk may have arrived to dominate the story, but Jasmine Crockett had just claimed the narrative. The silence from Jasmine's devastating slide still clung to the room like static when she finally leaned forward and spoke. It was her first line of the morning, and she delivered it not as a question, but as a blade sliding calmly across the surface of the hearing. Her tone was steady, almost quiet, but it rang out with a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. There was no flourish in her voice, no dramatics, just the weight of someone who had spent nights buried in spreadsheets that didn't add up, in districts that didn't receive, in systems that failed real people. She adjusted the mic slightly, made brief eye contact with the chairman, then turned to Musk with eyes sharpened not by anger, but by resolve. "Let's begin with Alteryx Systems," she said, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. She let the name linger, letting the unfamiliarity of it stir unease. The room held its breath. A company that, until 3 weeks ago, didn't exist in any federal vendor database. No payroll, no physical office, not even a working phone number. Now there was movement. Glances exchanged, pens lifted. A CNN producer sat up straighter. Jasmine clicked her remote. The screen behind her blinked to life again, showing a sterile transaction log, rows of numbers that looked cold, meaningless, until she added context. And yet, between March 3rd and March 24th, $2.7 billion was wired to Alteryx from the Digital Education Contingency Fund, a program intended to help underfunded school districts acquire basic technology. She didn't look at the screen. She didn't need to. That's $2.7 billion gone, while students in Mississippi, West Virginia, and South Texas still share broken Chromebooks from 2015. The weight of that sentence didn't hang in the air. It dropped like concrete. You could feel it, like a fist closing around the room's collective breath. No one blinked. No one shifted. The intensity wasn't theatrical. It was clinical, forensic. She wasn't reciting numbers. She was describing a theft, a betrayal with receipts. Behind her, the screen changed again. Now a U.S. map marked with dots in red. Each dot represented a school district flagged by federal inspectors for delayed or incomplete technology upgrades. Red spread across the Deep South and the Rust Belt like infection points. Jasmine didn't gesture dramatically. She simply let the screen speak for itself. "We traced the transaction chain," she said. "Alteryx lists its headquarters as 4189 Banner Loop, Nevada. My staff sent a team there last week." She paused. "It's a shack, a literal tool shed. No people, no desks, no servers, just a locked door and an overgrown yard." There were gasps now, not loud, not exaggerated, just the kind that come when truth rips away the illusion of complexity. But the money went through, fast, faster than procurement protocols would ever allow without internal override. She leaned back slightly, locking eyes with Musk once more. And then the last line, low but unshakable, which means someone with authority wanted it that way. Her words didn't accuse, they convicted. The weight of Jasmine's revelation still hung in the air like smoke that refused to clear. The image of a billion-dollar transaction ending in a padlocked shed had shifted the mood from curiosity to quiet alarm. But Elon Musk, seasoned in controversy, fluent in deflection, leaned forward with the posture of a man who'd been here before. Not in this exact chair, not under oath, but in rooms where truth bent easily under influence and numbers could be buried under noise. His voice was steady, calculated, the cadence of someone attempting to reassert control. "That's a logistics hub," he said, brushing his fingers lightly across the table. Dismissive. "Alteryx is a blockchain financial logistics unit. It handles decentralized disbursements to optimize state-level allocations. You're looking at innovation, not impropriety. The way he said it, like he was speaking to underachievers who just didn't get it, was as strategic as it was arrogant. A few heads in the back of the room nodded, not in agreement, but uncertainty. The kind of nods people give when they don't want to look uninformed on live television. But on the dais, there was no confusion. Jasmine Crockett hadn't moved an inch. Her shoulders were square, her notes untouched. And when she looked up again, her eyes were calm, but her expression carried a quiet finality, like the sound a gavel makes just before the sentence. She gave it a breath, one long, deliberate second, before speaking again. No edge in her tone, just a clarity that cut deeper than outrage ever could. Then perhaps you can explain, she said, fixing her gaze directly on Musk, why 87% of the invoices issued by Alteryx systems were transmitted from the same IP address, registered not to a data center, not to a field terminal, but to a private residence in Austin, Texas. This time the gasp wasn't whispered. It was audible. A sharp intake of breath swept the room like a gust before a storm. One of the Senate staffers dropped a pen. Even the chairman, who had remained neutral until now, shifted forward in his chair. Behind Jasmine, a new image appeared on the screen, a sleek, minimalist map with a single red beacon blinking steadily over a residential neighborhood. There was no dramatic music. It didn't need it. The image was more damning than any soundbite. Jasmine kept going, her voice still composed, but her words sharpening with every syllable. That address, she continued, is your personal residence. Same router, same static IP, used to generate, timestamp, and send billing requests totaling more than $2 billion. So tell me again, Mr. Musk, how this was a decentralized system? She didn't raise her voice. She didn't look around for validation. She didn't need to. The question hung in the room like a verdict already decided. What she laid bare wasn't just a contradiction. It was a fracture in Musk's entire defense. The very idea of decentralization, the core principle that he had wielded like a shield, had just been exposed as a facade, thin, traceable, and built from his own home. And in that moment, for the first time since he'd stepped into room 214, Elon Musk said nothing. The moment Jasmine finished her line about the Austin IP address, the air in the hearing room didn't settle. It tightened, like everyone present had just realized the oxygen was being rationed. And before anyone could react, before the cameras could even reset focus, Jasmine advanced again. The pace wasn't rushed, but deliberate, like a surgeon who knew exactly where to cut next. She clicked her remote. The massive screen behind her changed with a soft flicker, displaying something that looked, at first glance, unremarkable. A plain white document, a single-page invoice, no graphics, no branding, just simple black text on digital paper. It was the kind of file federal systems process by the thousands. But this one was different. This invoice, Jasmine began, her tone steady and unshaken, was paid in full 4 months ago. Her voice carried clearly across the hall. No need to raise it. The room was already hanging on every syllable. $92 million, she repeated, for a financial architecture model that, according to this document, was delivered in encrypted form to federal servers. The words themselves were cold, sterile, but Jasmine didn't rely on emotion to make her case. She relied on proof. She walked slowly toward the screen, not for drama, but for clarity, and tapped the document's title line with her index finger. The vendor that issued this invoice, she continued, is a company called Quanta Core Dynamics. Sounds impressive, right? Supposedly a leader in quantum financial design. Futuristic, scientific, untouchable. Then she turned slightly, clicked again, and the screen split in half. The left side still showed the invoice, but the right side, that drew a visible reaction. It was a screenshot from Google Maps, a street view image of a tired old building in Dayton, Ohio. The place looked forgotten by time. The paint on the bricks had chipped down to the concrete. The lot was cracked, the grass overgrown, and mounted above the rusted front door, a faded wooden sign still read, Tony's Smokehouse BBQ. A murmur rippled through the gallery. This, Jasmine said, never raising her voice, is the registered address of Quanta Core Dynamics. She let the absurdity speak for itself. No staff, no computers, no servers, no license to operate in finance. In fact, the only license this location has held in the last decade is for food service. Her tone turned even flatter, deliberate and deadly. And yet, this is where $92 million in taxpayer funds was sent for a financial model that no one at Treasury has ever seen. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was charged. No one dared look away. No one checked their phone. Even the camera crews in the back stood frozen, lenses locked in place. Jasmine stepped away from the screen now and returned to her seat. Her next words came not with fire, but with finality. But someone used this shell to request $92 million. And the metadata from the invoice file? She paused. It lists the document's author as a Musk. There it was. Not an accusation, a connection. Cold, digital, unmistakable. A hush fell over the room like a heavy curtain. The name, Musk, wasn't just a username. In that moment, it became evidence. Evidence that the country's richest man had his fingerprint on a payment trail leading to an empty barbecue joint in Ohio. Then, as if history itself had been waiting for someone to say it out loud, a voice from the right side of the dais, a congressman from Utah, conservative and previously silent, muttered into the silence, "We're talking about national-level fraud." He didn't shout. He didn't look at anyone. But the words hit like a gavel. Because now this wasn't just a hearing. It wasn't even about Musk anymore. It was about whether anyone, anywhere, was still bigger than the truth. The words national-level fraud had barely finished echoing through the chamber when Elon Musk acted. Not with panic, not with denial, but with the cold, deliberate calm of a man used to turning pressure into power. He reached into a thick binder beside him, pulled out a single sheet of paper protected in a clear plastic sleeve, and held it up, like a shield against what was coming. He spoke with confidence, his voice smooth and rehearsed. "This," he said clearly, "is a memorandum of understanding, signed by the Department of Energy, permitting the development and deployment of autonomous financial intelligence systems." He didn't wait for questions. He placed the document on the table and slid it forward, directly into the hands of the committee. Every movement he made seemed to say, "See, this was allowed." Then came the next line, measured, powerful. Self-directed AI funding, approved by the government itself. You call it theft, I call it policy. As he finished speaking, the main screen behind him lit up, now showing the full document. It looked official. The formatting, the headers, the legal tone, everything felt real. And then, at the bottom of the page, in bold ink, was a signature. L. M. Dillard, Secretary of Energy. The room paused. For the first time that morning, doubt briefly crossed a few faces. Some lawmakers leaned closer. Aides exchanged quick glances. From a distance, this wasn't a defense. It was a counterstrike. A document with a cabinet-level signature? If it held up, it could change everything. Journalists in the gallery scrambled to zoom in on the signature. One camera operator whispered, "Is this real?" under his breath. On social media, the live stream chat exploded. Musk's supporters were already posting hashtags like #MOU proof and #government greenlight. And for a few seconds, it worked. Elon Musk looked composed, in control, maybe even victorious. But Jasmine Crockett didn't move. Not 1 inch. She stared at the screen, not confused, not rattled, but calm. Because she already knew what the others didn't. This wasn't a document that proved innocence. It was a trap he had just walked into himself. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't glance at her team. She didn't look at the reporters. She didn't even look at Elon Musk. Because she didn't need to. The moment he slid that printed memorandum across the table like it was his legal armor, Jasmine already knew what it was, and more importantly, what it wasn't. While the room held its breath, she simply tapped her tablet, cool and quiet, as if turning a page in a story she'd already read to the end. And that was when the screen behind her changed. Again. Gone was the version Elon had presented, full of bloated language and sweeping powers. Now a second version came into view, stark and clean. It carried the same title, the same official seal of the Department of Energy, even the same date, January 12th, 2024. The font matched. The formatting was nearly identical. But something was very different. Something subtle, yet seismic. Side by side, both documents were projected for the nation to see. The left side, Elon Musk's version, planted, prepared, and dramatic. The right side, the version filed on record, verifiable, quiet, and devastating. Jasmine rose slightly, her hands never shaking, her voice never raised. What Mr. Musk has presented, she said with the precision of a closing argument, is not the full document. She gestured toward the right-hand projection. Her tone was sharper now, like steel being drawn from a sheath. This, she continued, motioning clearly for all to see, is the original, unedited version, filed directly with the Department of Energy on January 12th, 2024. She didn't have to say the rest yet. The committee members were already leaning closer, scanning the words with their own eyes. Paragraph by paragraph, the differences emerged like invisible ink under heat. At first it was subtle, a few phrases missing, a header repositioned, but then on page 4 the gap widened, and what was absent became impossible to ignore. The room began to still, not from surprise but from recognition. There was no clause authorizing AI systems to control federal funds. There were no lines approving autonomous financial intelligence engines. The sweeping authority Musk had claimed just minutes earlier was nowhere to be found. Not blacked out, not redacted, just absent entirely. The truth wasn't hiding. It had never been there to begin with. Jasmine took a breath, her voice unwavering. "There is no provision," she said slowly, clearly, and with the weight of accountability, "for the unilateral use of public funds by private AI systems. None. The clause Mr. Musk refers to does not appear in the original memorandum because it was never approved." And with that, the illusion shattered. A dozen reactions rippled through the room like a slow-building earthquake. One senator jerked upright in his chair, whispering something urgent to a staffer. Another pinched the bridge of his nose as if trying to will away what he'd just seen. Even a few Republican members, who had up to that point kept their arms crossed and eyes skeptical, were now openly exchanging side glances, brows furrowed in disbelief. For the first time all morning, Musk was no longer holding the floor. His fingers, once laced confidently on the table, now twitched slightly. His eyes flicked toward the screen, then to the printed document in front of him, still protected in its clear plastic sleeve, as though the illusion of formality could still carry weight. The silence was loud, louder than shouting, louder than protest. It was the kind of silence that meant something had just turned. The momentum had shifted, not subtly but completely, and everyone in the room knew it. From the press gallery above, one journalist muttered under her breath, "That's game." Another whispered, "He forged it." On the live stream, chat feeds exploded. The hashtags flipped instantly. Original memo fiction by Musk Crockett uncovers truth in Jasmine. She didn't celebrate. She didn't break eye contact with the committee, because she wasn't here for a moment. She was here for accountability, for the people whose laptops never arrived, for the schools whose funding disappeared, for the taxpayers who had no idea their money was being funneled through empty promises and pixelated paper trails. The illusion of legitimacy had just been stripped away, and what remained was fraud dressed in federal letterhead. The weight of the forged memorandum still sat heavy in the room when Jasmine Crockett leaned slightly toward her microphone. She didn't rush. She didn't raise her voice. She simply spoke 5 words with quiet authority. "I'd like to bring in a witness." Immediately, the lights dimmed slightly, and the hearing room's main screen faded to black. The anticipation returned like a tightening thread. Everyone could feel something coming, something different. You could almost hear the cameras locking focus, the sharp breath of an aide holding a notepad too tightly. This wasn't just about documents anymore. Jasmine was about to put a voice to the deception. Then the screen flickered. A live stream feed appeared. The frame was grainy, the lighting deliberately dark. The man's face was completely obscured by a deep hood, his features hidden in shadow. His voice, distorted by a modulator, was deep and mechanical, but beneath the artificial filter, It was clearly human. A single label appeared below him. Former senior engineer, Neurocore AI division. He didn't pause. He didn't hesitate. And what he said next changed the air in the room. What we sold, the voice began, calm but saturated with something deeper, remorse perhaps, or fatigue, was a single prototype, an unfinished AI budgeting tool with no real backend, just interface graphics. And we cloned it. The words landed without drama, but the silence that followed was deafening. People didn't shift in their chairs. They froze in them. Committee members turned their heads slowly, almost in disbelief. Staffers began whispering frantically behind their hands. Every person watching the live stream, in that moment, knew they were no longer listening to allegations. They were hearing a confession. Mr. Musk approved repackaging the exact same software, under different brand names, for separate state contracts, the voice continued, unshaken. The code didn't change, only the name on the invoice. What had once been a slow-burning scandal had just exploded into a full-scale exposé. And still the whistleblower spoke, not bitterly, not emotionally, but with the kind of cold clarity that comes only when the truth can no longer stay buried. Each version looked new on the surface, he said, but underneath, it did nothing. It was a shell, just a PowerPoint on top of a non-functional algorithm. Gasps now, audible, involuntary. But it was the next sentence that cracked the room open completely. We once printed a demo screen, just a screenshot, and walked away with $600 million in signed contracts. In the seconds that followed, no one spoke. Not the chairman, not the aides, not even Elon Musk. His usual defiance had hardened into something quieter now. Uncertainty, maybe even fear. The smirk was gone. His eyes, once darting toward cameras and lawmakers with confidence, now stared down at the surface of the desk in front of him. Because this wasn't an opinion. This wasn't a theory or a rival politician's attack line. This was inside knowledge, and it was live. Jasmine Crockett remained still. She didn't need to add commentary. The facts were louder than anything she could say, because in that moment, every person in the room understood what they were hearing. This wasn't just corruption. This was a scam on a national scale. Taxpayer money traded for fake code and PowerPoint slides. Promises sold by a billionaire, backed by nothing, and cashed in for millions. This wasn't a software flaw. It was a moral failure. The weight of the whistleblower's testimony still hung in the air like a black veil. The room hadn't moved. It hadn't exhaled. It was as if every breath had been suspended between disbelief and outrage. The words, "We printed a demo screen and walked away with $600 million weren't just shocking. They were radioactive. You could feel them pulsing in the walls, traveling through every microphone, reverberating through every live stream. And for a long, brutal moment, Elon Musk said nothing. He just stared straight ahead, his jaw locked, hands clenched on the table like he was bracing for impact. But then, something cracked. With a sudden sharp sound, his palm slammed against the hardwood table. It wasn't a casual gesture. It wasn't frustration. It was fury, raw, unfiltered, and loud. Several members of the chamber flinched. Aides jumped. The courtroom-style stillness shattered. "I'm not a thief," Musk shouted, his voice rising for the first time since the hearing began. The volume surged, bouncing off the chamber's high walls. "I'm not a thief. I'm building the future. I'm solving the problems no one else dares to touch. You think it's easy? You think these systems create themselves?" His hands were out now, sweeping across the table, his face flushed red. "I'm the only one moving this country forward while you sit here throwing stones. I don't apologize for vision." It was more than a defense. It was a breakdown disguised as a manifesto. His voice cracked slightly at the end, not from weakness, but from the sheer effort of holding together a narrative that had begun to crumble before a global audience. He wasn't arguing policy anymore. He was fighting for survival, clinging to the one identity that had protected him for decades. The visionary, the builder, the man ahead of his time. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't recoil. She didn't even look surprised. She sat still for one long beat, letting the rage burn itself out like a fire that had run out of oxygen. Then she leaned forward, elbows on the desk, and looked Musk directly in the eye. Her voice, when it came, was barely louder than a whisper, but it cut through the chamber like a scalpel. Each word slow, deliberate, cold with truth. "The problem," she said, "is that you built it with money taken from the poor, then slapped the word vision on top of it like that made it holy." The chamber froze. For a full 2 seconds, no one spoke. No one moved. The line dropped like a lead weight, through every floor, every camera, every screen. And then suddenly the silence cracked wide open. From the far right of the panel, a voice rose, not in protest, but in applause. A single opposition lawmaker, who had sat arms crossed for the entire hearing, leaned back in his seat and clapped. Once, twice, then 3 times. It echoed sharply through the marble-lined walls. Then another joined him, and another. The public gallery, where families of underfunded schools had been watching quietly all morning, erupted into a soft, steady wave of applause. Not loud or chaotic, but resolute. Musk's head dipped slightly. His jaw was still set, but the fire in his eyes had dulled. The narrative had turned, not because someone shouted louder, but because someone had spoken the truth plainly. Outside the chamber, social media erupted. The moment was clipped and posted in seconds. The caption under every repost read the same line. "You built it with money taken from the poor, then called it vision." And across the country, from forgotten classrooms to under-equipped hospitals, people were listening. Because for once, someone had said what they had all felt for years. And the room once ruled by silence and power now belonged to the truth. The room was still trembling from the aftershock of Jasmine's last words. "You built it with money taken from the poor," when she turned back to the table in front of her and picked up one final folder. Her movements were calm, deliberate, and almost too quiet for what was coming next. But anyone who had been watching her this entire hearing knew, when Jasmine Crockett went silent, the truth was about to roar. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't stand. She didn't need to. She simply slid the last document across the polished wood toward the chairman and said, "One more file, Mr. Chairman. This one involves the pandemic relief funds." A murmur swept through the room. The phrase pandemic relief carried a different weight. It wasn't just about budgets and grants anymore. It was about desperation, loss, and the billions allocated during America's most vulnerable moment. This wasn't just fraud. This was betrayal in the middle of national crisis. The screen behind Jasmine came to life again, this time displaying a scanned PDF titled Emergency Disbursement Agreement, COVID Fiscal Recovery Act. Beneath the title was a familiar name. The agency's signature line had been filled, signed, and stamped. Marshall J. Graves, Director of Disbursements, Federal Recovery Office. The signature was clean. The digital timestamp matched the week the disbursement was approved. Everything looked perfect, but as Jasmine tapped her tablet once more, 2 additional screens appeared on either side of the main projection. Side by side, forensic software in real time. And then she said it. "This signature," Jasmine said slowly, letting each word hit the room like a gavel, "is not real. It was generated using deepfake AI, an artificial replication of an actual public servant's writing style. Not just forged, but manufactured." The chamber exploded, not in volume, but in tension. Eyes widened, mouths opened. It was as if the very air had thickened. Behind her, the forensic expert sitting quietly on the second row of the witness gallery stood, holding a tablet in both hands. The chairman nodded to him wordlessly. The expert stepped forward, voice firm and precise. "Our analysis, conducted using layered signature authentication tools, confirms that this signature does not match any known signature in the Federal Employment Archive. The stroke pattern, the pressure points, and the vector path suggest algorithmic modeling, not human execution." He held up the screen. It showed a 3D breakdown of the signature line. One layer peeled back, then another. With each removal, it became more obvious. There was no hand behind this ink, just math, just mimicry. In short, the expert said with finality, this signature does not exist in any government records. It was never written. It was never witnessed. It is digitally generated. Gasps. Audible. One senator nearly dropped his pen. Another leaned back in his chair as if trying to physically distance himself from the horror of what was unfolding. Jasmine said nothing. She didn't need to. She stood completely still, letting the gravity of the revelation crush the last defenses still standing around Musk. The chairman adjusted his microphone. His hands were trembling now, not from nerves but from fury. He turned slightly to face the sergeant-at-arms stationed near the hearing room side entrance. Begin formal request for criminal investigation. Immediate referral to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. This hearing has crossed into federal fraud jurisdiction. And then the final image, Elon Musk. No outburst this time, no smirk, no speech, no attempt to interrupt. He didn't lift his head. He didn't make eye contact. He simply stared downward at the fake signature projected in front of him. His empire's last defense, now burning under forensic light. His hands, once so expressive, now lay still against the table. He did not protest. He did not deny. He just lowered his head. And in that gesture, quiet, small, and irreversible, every person in the room understood that the story was over. Not the fight, not the fallout, but the illusion. It was gone. Finally, irrevocably. And for the first time in that chamber, truth stood without being challenged. The moment Elon Musk lowered his head, silently surrendering to the weight of evidence, the echo of that image left the chamber and detonated across the world. There was no need for a verdict. The public had already seen the receipts, heard the voice, and watched the empire crack under its own artificial signature. And just like that, the walls of Capitol Hill gave way to something even louder. The global roar of media, headlines, and digital outrage. The first wave hit within minutes. CNN, MSNBC, and Fox all broke programming simultaneously to flash red banners across the bottom of their screens. Breaking, Musk accused of deepfake signature in $600 million fraud case. Live, Jasmine Crockett shatters AI defense. FBI launches criminal probe into SpaceX-affiliated pandemic funds. On every major news channel, anchors spoke in hushed tones, struggling to keep up with the story unfolding in real time. The headlines came fast, stacking on top of one another like aftershocks. Elon Musk, visionary or financial predator? Jasmine Crockett, the woman who dared to cross the line and made it move. $12.2 billion missing. One voice refused to look away. And while the networks scrambled to fact-check and frame their angles, the internet had no such patience. The viral storm exploded like dry tinder under a magnifying glass. On Twitter, TikTok, and Reddit, millions tuned in to rewatch the exact moment the livestream witness said, "We walked away with $600 million in signed contracts." Within 10 minutes, it had been clipped, subtitled, reposted in 7 languages. And then came the hashtags, waves of them, crashing over every trending topic. 12 billion trail, tracking the money that vanished into fake shell companies. Jasmine unmasked Elon, celebrating the moment Congresswoman Crockett exposed the forgery. Fraud over future, a brutal twist on Musk's brand of techno-utopianism. Even more hashtags followed in rapid succession. Vision or theft Crockett. 2026 fake signatures, real crimes PowerPoint gate. On Instagram, artists sketched political cartoons within hours. One viral post showed Musk holding a blueprint titled The Future, with billions of tax dollars falling from the bottom as Jasmine stood beneath him, holding a single burning document. The caption read, "She didn't yell. She didn't beg. She just opened the file." On YouTube, live-stream commentary channels ran replays with frame-by-frame analysis, pointing to the exact millisecond Musk's hand clenched, the shift in his breathing, the subtle collapse of posture when the AI-forged signature was exposed. Legal experts weighed in. Former prosecutors began using words like wire fraud, racketeering, and federal indictment timeline. But while the headlines screamed, Jasmine Crockett remained silent. No press conference, no victory lap, no choreographed celebration. She left the hearing the same way she entered it, focused, measured, and mission-driven. Cameras followed her as she exited through the side of the building, escorted only by a single staffer and a handful of Capitol Police. Yet the country couldn't stop talking. Cable debates ignited, now not just about Elon Musk, but about what we call genius and what we excuse in its name. One panel on PBS asked, "Are we too quick to forgive innovation when it steals from the vulnerable?" A segment on BBC World posed the question, can AI ambition ever justify human exploitation? And across living rooms, classrooms, and courtroom corridors, people began to replay not just Jasmine's facts, but her tone. She hadn't come into that room to perform. She came to hold a mirror up to power and refused to look away when the reflection turned ugly. But not everyone was celebrating. In tech investor circles, panic began to spread. Emails leaked showing venture capital firms quietly reevaluating their portfolios with Musk-affiliated ventures. Tesla stock dipped 8% in the final hour of trading. Neuralink froze hiring. And for the first time in over a decade, SpaceX issued a press blackout. Even Washington's power brokers felt the shift. Behind closed doors, lawmakers were reportedly divided. Some whispered about Crockett overstepping. Others, though, saw a new kind of political currency in what she'd done. One senator, off camera but caught on a hot mic, muttered, "She didn't just bring down Musk, she reminded this country what accountability looks like." And as the sun set over Washington that night, the photos flooded every major front page. Not of Musk, not of the committee, but of Jasmine. Standing alone on the Capitol steps, no podium, no teleprompter, just her, still in the same navy blazer, still holding the same tablet that changed everything. The expression on her face wasn't one of triumph. It was heavier than that. Like she knew the real cost of truth wasn't in the delivering, but in what came after. Because while Elon Musk had built empires on rockets, code, and power plays, Jasmine Crockett had done something rarer. She had walked into the heart of wealth, silence, and institutional complicity, and refused to speak gently to it. She hadn't chased headlines. They had chased her, because no one could deny it anymore. Elon Musk may have shaped a generation of technology, but Jasmine Crockett had just reshaped its accountability. And that, more than any launch or innovation, was the moment that would be remembered. The firestorm outside the Capitol hadn't faded when Jasmine Crockett emerged from the building's east steps. Flashbulbs erupted before her first shoe met the stone. Reporters surged forward, microphones extended like spears, voices layered in chaos, each one trying to make their headline the next viral quote. Behind her, the rotunda still buzzed with disbelief, but Jasmine didn't look back. Her shoulders were squared, her stride even. She wasn't walking away from a victory. She was walking straight through the center of something broken. A sea of cameras parted slightly as one voice rose above the rest. It wasn't shouted, but asked with the quiet hope of a nation watching from behind glass screens. "Do you think you've won, Congresswoman?" The reporter didn't name Musk. He didn't need to. The question hovered there, thick with implications. About power, about truth, about the meaning of justice when wealth has long stood in its place. Jasmine stopped, slowly, fully. And in that instant, the crowd did too. The hum of noise around her stilled, like the atmosphere itself leaned in to hear what would follow. She turned her head, eyes steady, and met the reporter's gaze without hesitation. Her voice didn't need amplification. She didn't lift a mic. She didn't ask for silence. She didn't whisper. But the world heard every word. "The real win," she said, "doesn't happen when he lowers his head. The real win is when the people finally know where their tax dollars went." She held there, no smile, no triumphant pose. Just clarity, sharp as steel. The kind of clarity that doesn't beg for applause because it already knows the weight of what it carries. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The microphones lowered. The cameras stayed fixed but still. It was as if everyone knew. This wasn't just the end of a hearing. It was the beginning of something harder, deeper, more uncomfortable. The moment didn't feel like victory. It felt like reckoning. And Jasmine didn't flinch under it. She turned, descended the final 3 steps, and disappeared into a black SUV, waiting quietly at the curb. There were no sirens, no escorts. just a quiet door shut behind her. And then the rush returned. Reporters calling out, cameramen scrambling for angles. But the quote had already been captured, and the silence that followed it said more than any broadcast could. That night, every major outlet ran the clip, looped on television, stitched into reels, dissected by analysts. But none of them had to dress it up. Jasmine's line stood on its own. The real win is when the people finally know where their tax dollars went. On Twitter, the phrase became its own headline. On TikTok, teenagers turned it into voiceovers layered with footage of overcrowded classrooms and closed rural hospitals. In barbershops, boardrooms, and bus stops, people repeated it, not like a soundbite, but like a measuring stick. Where did it go? Where was it supposed to go? Who kept it from getting there? By morning, the world had caught up. The New York Times ran its Sunday edition with a front-page headline in bold serif, black ink across clean white. The day tech was held accountable. Underneath it, a single image. Jasmine Crockett, standing alone beneath the Capitol's columns, eyes level with the lens. The blue sky cloudless behind her. No drama, no chaos, just conviction. The editorial that followed read more like a confession than a commentary. It spoke of years spent glorifying innovation while ignoring the damage left in its shadow. It named the ways oversight had failed, not just politically, but morally. And it ended not by praising Crockett, but by warning the nation. Accountability must never wait until the money's gone. Other headlines followed suit. The Guardian called her the quiet flame. The Washington Post labeled the hearing Silicon Valley's Watergate. Time magazine, preparing its next issue, fast-tracked a cover with Jasmine's photo and one question etched across it in bold red. Who guards the future? The stock market, still reeling, saw tech futures dip sharply. Congressional offices reported hundreds of thousands of emails demanding new legislation to prevent another misuse of federal funds. 2 governors announced internal audits of their AI grant programs. And the FBI confirmed that the criminal investigation into Musk's companies had officially begun. But amidst the whirlwind, Jasmine remained where she always had, out of the spotlight, inside her district office, reviewing new legislation designed to put federal contract databases into public view. Because while the world had declared her a hero, she didn't see it that way. She wasn't here to be remembered. She was here to make sure the next time someone asked, "Where did our money go?" they didn't have to wait 5 years for an answer. She had already said it on the steps, but now the country was starting to understand what she meant. It wasn't about a man bowing his head. It was about lifting everyone else's. And that, no matter how much noise followed, was the only victory that mattered. The country was still reeling. Investigations were underway. Media outlets were in full post-mortem mode. And the public, angry, awake, and relentless, wasn't letting go. Jasmine Crockett's words were still echoing in households and hearing rooms alike. The real win is when the people finally know where their tax dollars went. But while the headlines roared and social media crowned her a truth teller, Jasmine had already moved to the next battlefield, the one that rarely made viral clips, but determined everything: legislation. It began quietly without press conferences or viral sound bites. Just a plain white folder carried under her arm, marked only by a black Sharpie. Transparency Act Draft, JC. Inside were 47 pages of policy, oversight reform, and digital accountability infrastructure. A blueprint to make sure what happened in that hearing would never happen again. No more shell companies disguised in acronyms. No more AI-generated signatures sliding past procurement offices. No more silence. No more hiding. And so, just 4 days after the explosive hearing, Jasmine Crockett stood before the House Appropriations Committee and submitted a bill that would change the way federal money moved through the American system. The chamber was packed, not just with lawmakers, but with activists, journalists, and victims of past bureaucratic failure. Everyone wanted to see what she would do next. And Jasmine? She didn't come with fire this time. She came with law. The bill was called the Crockett Fiscal Transparency Act of 2025. Its language was simple, but every line was sharp enough to draw blood. It demanded that every federal contract over $10 million include a publicly accessible digital trail. From the first draft of the proposal to the last invoice paid, it called for mandatory real-time disclosures of vendor ownership, AI integration reports, and third-party verification of all signatures on any federal disbursement. But the heart of it, the clause that made committee members squirm in their chairs, was Section 4, Citizen Audit Rights. Under that clause, every American taxpayer would be able to log into a secure portal, enter their zip code, and see exactly where every federal dollar touching their district was going. Not through summaries, not through redacted memos, through actual time-stamped line items. If a laptop grant was delayed, the portal would show why. If a software contract changed names midstream, the public would see who signed off. No intermediaries, no explanations. Just truth. The chamber grew tense as she read that clause aloud, not because it was radical, but because it was unavoidable. For decades, politicians had promised transparency. Jasmine had written it into code. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. She simply looked at the room and said, "If we don't let the public follow the money, we're not running a democracy. We're running a casino." That line made it into every news broadcast that night. But behind the scenes, resistance was swift. Lobbyists flooded committee offices within hours, calling the bill too aggressive, technologically burdensome, and a threat to proprietary systems. Several tech firms quietly assembled a coalition to review and offer revisions. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She took the meetings. She listened. Then she walked out and refused to strip a single provision. Because she knew what they were really afraid of wasn't exposure, it was memory. For the first time, the American public had watched fraud unfold in real time, and they hadn't looked away. Jasmine wasn't riding momentum. She was harnessing it into statute. And when the bill hit the floor for debate, the pressure reached a boiling point. Lawmakers who'd once dismissed her as performative now found themselves quoting her. One moderate from Pennsylvania called the bill "our best shot at restoring public trust." A progressive from Illinois called it reparations for decades of institutional gaslighting. Even a conservative from Utah, after days of silence, stood and said, "You may not agree with how she delivered the truth, but you cannot deny that it was the truth." As the vote loomed, no one could predict the outcome. The halls of Congress were filled with the kind of anxiety usually reserved for wartime resolutions. Reporters camped outside. Advocacy groups launched call-in campaigns. Hundreds of thousands of emails flooded congressional inboxes, all echoing the same phrase, "Pass the Crockett Act." And Jasmine? She didn't watch the coverage. She didn't tweet. She spent the night before the vote alone in her office, revisiting every line of the bill, marking places where future amendments might strengthen it even more. She didn't want a headline. She wanted permanence. Because this wasn't about Elon Musk anymore. It was about the next billion-dollar lie and how to stop it before it started. The following morning, at precisely 10:02 a.m., the vote began. One by one, the green lights lit up, then red, then green again. Onlookers held their breath. Staffers watched with fingers crossed. And when the final tally appeared, 268 in favor, 161 against, the chamber erupted. Not with celebration, but with something heavier, relief. Relief that finally the truth had a structure to stand on. And as the final gavel dropped, Jasmine Crockett didn't cheer. She simply closed her folder, stood up, and walked out of the chamber the same way she had entered it months ago, quietly, confidently, and without a single doubt about why she was there. Because this wasn't a legacy. It was a warning to every shadow still hiding behind a screen. The vote was over. The cameras had gone dark. The headlines were already echoing through every corridor of the internet. But long after the final gavel fell and the press vans pulled away from the Capitol, something deeper remained, an invisible current running beneath the surface of the nation. It wasn't about Elon Musk anymore. It wasn't even about the $12 billion. It was about what this fight exposed, a truth America had long whispered, but rarely dared to face head-on. And in that truth lived a human lesson far larger than any courtroom verdict. At the center of it all stood Jasmine Crockett, not just as a congresswoman, not even as a symbol, but as a reminder of what it costs to challenge power that has never been questioned before. The injustice she faced wasn't just systemic, it was personal. From the moment she opened her file to the instant she walked out of that chamber, she stood alone against a machine built to silence, confuse, and delay. But what she proved, without theatrics, without revenge, was that integrity does not need permission to exist. It simply needs someone willing to bear the weight of standing still while the rest of the world tries to spin. And that weight, that resistance, that's where the lesson begins. Because this was never just about signatures and missing money. It was about the quiet assumption that no one would look too closely, that a name like Musk could shield corruption with charisma, that innovation could excuse theft, that complexity could hide intent. The real battle wasn't over AI systems or forged contracts. It was over something far older and more dangerous. The idea that those with vision are entitled to skip the rules written for everyone else. That belief unchecked becomes poison. Jasmine Crockett faced that poison, drank it publicly, and still walked out upright. And in doing so, she didn't just challenge a billionaire. She challenged a belief that had made injustice feel inevitable. There's something chilling about how easy it was for all of it to happen. A fake company in an Ohio barbecue shack, an AI-generated signature undetectable without expert tools, a billion-dollar invoice approved by a digital sleight of hand. None of it looked like a crime until someone had the courage to say, wait, that doesn't make sense. Jasmine said it. She said it not with screaming or spectacle, but with patience and precision. And that patience revealed another lesson. That courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's a woman alone in her office at 2 a.m., reading a memo for the 6th time because something still doesn't sit right. And that's where the real fight begins. Not in the hearing room, but in the long hours before anyone's watching. We live in a time where attention is currency, where outrage is rewarded more than truth. But Jasmine's path defied that. She didn't go viral for yelling. She went viral for exposing, for asking the questions no one else dared to ask, and for listening when others were too busy performing. She didn't just hold Elon Musk accountable. She held herself accountable first, to the people she represented, to the teachers who never got their classroom grants, to the nurses using broken tablets in rural clinics, to every taxpayer who has been told year after year, we can't fund that right now, while somewhere else a billionaire printed PowerPoints and walked off with millions. And then there's the whistleblower. We'll never know his name. His voice was altered. His face was hidden. But his choice, to step forward into the storm, knowing full well what might happen next, was a lesson in moral clarity. Not all heroes are born from conflict. Some are created by conscience. He reminded us that sometimes the most radical act in a corrupt world is simply telling the truth. That courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it trembles. Sometimes it stutters. But still, it speaks. And when it does, the system has no choice but to listen. There was also a lesson for those who didn't speak, for the advisors who looked the other way, for the agencies that signed the checks without reading the fine print, for the journalists who only started digging after the scandal broke. Their silence wasn't just complicity, it was evidence. Evidence that systems don't break in one dramatic moment. They erode slowly, quietly under the weight of people who don't ask questions because the answers might cost too much. And yet, the biggest lesson may be the simplest. That power, when left unchallenged, does not evolve. It expands. It spreads. It finds new forms. Today, it's deep fake signatures. Tomorrow, it's AI-generated contracts. The tools will change, but the temptation stays the same. And so, the question becomes not just how do we punish what happened, but how do we prevent what comes next? That's where Jasmine's final act, the Crockett Fiscal Transparency Act, becomes more than policy. It becomes promise. A promise that next time, someone will be watching. That next time, silence won't be the default setting. That next time, the people won't have to wait for a disaster to learn what happened to their money. It's not a fix-all, but it's a line in the sand. And sometimes that's where change begins. But no law, no hearing, no headline can fix everything. The real work now belongs to us, to the voters who decide whether transparency is worth fighting for, to the journalists who must ask the second question, not just the first, To the educators who teach their students not just to code AI, but to question who's using it and why. To the citizens who refuse to be distracted by spectacle when lives are shaped by spreadsheets. And to the next Jasmine, because there will be another woman, another worker, another voice in a room full of silence, deciding whether or not to speak. And when she does, we must remember this moment, not as a unique victory, but as a blueprint. A reminder that real power doesn't come from controlling systems. It comes from being willing to stand against them when they no longer serve the people they were built to protect. This wasn't just a political story, it was a moral one. And the human lesson at its heart is this: we are not powerless, not when we ask the right questions, not when we demand to see the receipts, and not when we remember that democracy isn't what happens when the powerful are speaking. It's what begins when we finally stop listening in silence. And if that was the lesson, the moral that thundered beneath every headline and echoed through every committee chamber, then what follows cannot simply be reflection, it must be action. Because stories like Jasmine Crockett's do not end at the Capitol steps. They begin there. They are not closed chapters, they are open summons. And now that we've seen what happens when silence is broken, when a lone voice stands before a billionaire and says, "Show us the truth," we are faced with a single, undeniable question. What will we do with that courage? It starts here. Not with grand speeches, not with anger flaring in comment threads, but with vigilance, with the quiet, sustained force of people who are no longer willing to be ignored. If you are a taxpayer, you are not a bystander. You fund this nation. Your work, your sweat, your hours, they built the roads, the satellites, the software, the aid programs. You have a right to know where every dollar goes. Not someday, not when the damage is done. Now. Because if Jasmine taught us anything, it's that oversight delayed is justice denied, and every signature hidden from the public eye is an opportunity for corruption to dress itself in ambition. So we ask you, don't let this story be a moment. Make it a movement. Call your representatives. Demand support for the Crockett Fiscal Transparency Act. Ask where your local school district's federal tech grant went. Question the names behind the next cutting-edge innovation before they become the next scandal. Because transparency is not the enemy of progress. It is the only way progress survives. If you are in the media, stop chasing volume and start chasing verification. Ask the third question, not just the first. If you are in government, look around your office. At the stack of contracts, the unexplained invoices, the reports no one's opened in months, and ask yourself, what would happen if someone like Jasmine walked in right now? And if you are in tech, this is your mirror moment. Innovation without accountability is not brilliance. It's theft with better branding. Build systems that explain themselves. Design AI that leaves a trail. Refuse to hide behind complexity. Because if your product can't survive public scrutiny, maybe it's not the future at all. And if you are a citizen, just one person reading this, watching this, feeling the knot in your chest, you already have the power. You are the storm they fear, not with violence, not with chaos, but with clarity, with questions, with persistence, with the courage to demand that the next Jasmine is never standing alone again. The truth is, we should never have needed her to carry this fight alone. We should have stood beside her long before the cameras ever turned on. So ask yourself right now in this breath, what will I no longer allow to go unseen? What lie will I no longer let pass unchallenged? Whose silence will I no longer call wisdom? This isn't just a call to action. This is your invitation to wake up, because the next billion-dollar scheme is already being written. The next AI-generated fraud is already in code. The next fake contract is already printing. And somewhere out there, another woman is preparing to walk into a hearing room, armed with nothing but documents, questions, and the audacity to believe that truth still matters. Will she stand alone? Or will you be ready? This is your moment. Don't just watch history, shape it. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. During a nationally televised hearing, Crockett confronts Justice Elena Kagan over her decision to ban military recruiters at Harvard Law, a move meant to protest "don't ask, don't tell," but one that slammed the door on poor and minority students hoping to serve. One woman fights for those erased by elite ideals. The other defends a principle that came with a hidden human cost. Now, as moral authority is put on trial, Capitol Hill becomes the battleground for who justice really serves. When ethics becomes selective, who gets sacrificed? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. It began like a tremor beneath the polished floors of the Capitol. Quiet whispers, eyes narrowing behind oak doors, phones lighting up with coded messages. Within 48 hours, those tremors became a quake. A federal subcommittee announced an emergency judicial ethics hearing, not to investigate a lobbyist, not a rogue judge from a district court, but a sitting justice of the United States Supreme Court. The subject? A question so volatile it hadn't been asked in over 3 decades. Had members of the Supreme Court used their positions to cement personal influence at elite universities and manipulate political narratives? What made it even more incendiary wasn't just who was being called, it was who was doing the questioning. Across every headline, the same name exploded: Jasmine Crockett. Young, sharp, unapologetically principled. The youngest member of the committee and the only one with direct experience challenging power in both courtrooms and Congress. Critics dismissed her as a performative pick. Pundits sneered she was a camera magnet in a room full of robes. But behind the scenes, it was clear. No one else had the tenacity, the memory, or the moral clarity to stand toe-to-toe with who was coming. The moment the subpoena hit, shockwaves rattled through every branch of government. Justice Elena Kagan, Harvard law icon, former Solicitor General, and widely considered the intellectual backbone of the liberal bloc, was summoned. Not for her opinions on Roe or Chevron, but for her time as Dean of Harvard Law, and whether she, like others, had used her academic station to build invisible power structures while masking them in legal theory. It would be the first time a Supreme Court justice was publicly questioned in Congress since 1989. The Senate chamber would become an arena, and in the center of it, a woman in her 30s from South Dallas, facing down one of the most respected legal minds in modern history. But just as the room began to settle into the formality of procedure, Jasmine Crockett shifted the air with a tone so calm it felt surgical, like the quiet right before a blade touches skin. She sat upright, spine aligned as if the weight of the entire proceeding rested on her shoulders, because in a way it did. Cameras buzzed softly in the background, but her voice was measured, deliberate, grounded in a rare stillness. "Justice Kagan," she began, her southern cadence softened by careful diction. "I want to start by acknowledging something the media too often forgets. Your opinions, particularly in Arizona Free Enterprise and King vs. Burwell, have stood as vital pillars of judicial balance." There was no sarcasm in her tone, just a cool, deliberate respect. She understood the battlefield she was stepping onto and chose to open with truth, not flattery. For a moment, it felt like any other hearing. Then came the shift, a single breath, a tightening of the jaw. Her voice, now quieter, took on a clarity that sliced clean through protocol. "That's why I must ask. When you barred military recruiters from Harvard's campus because of 'don't ask, don't tell,' do you believe that was a reverse form of discrimination?" The air inside the chamber evaporated. Some looked down, others looked up. Kagan looked forward, but her eyes stopped blinking. The question didn't just reference policy, it cracked open a wound. It forced everyone to remember 2005, a year where symbolism, political positioning, and academic ethics collided. Kagan, then a rising star and dean of Harvard Law, had taken a stand against a military policy that excluded LGBTQ+ individuals. But what had never been asked on the record, certainly not like this, was what that stance cost, especially to those not protected by tenure, reputation, or legacy. Jasmine continued, each word landing not as an accusation, but as a demand for honest reckoning. Because if the principle was equality, then let me ask, what about the low-income black students who saw the military as their only path out? Was that not also a voice worth protecting? Her tone was steady, but it trembled with something more powerful than anger. Grief. Grief for the students who had no lobbying groups, no alumni boards, no microphones. Students whose ambition was real, but whose access was conditional. Her voice gave form to what they'd felt, but never heard spoken aloud in a room like this. Across the long mahogany table, Kagan's lips parted. Her expression remained composed, almost too composed, but the delay in her response said everything. It wasn't that she didn't know the answer. It was that the question had never been allowed to breathe long enough to form in public. For the first time in decades, a Supreme Court justice wasn't just being challenged on the law, but on the impact of her silence. There was no applause, no gasps, just a silence so dense it felt like a verdict had already been delivered. And Jasmine, she didn't lean back. She didn't gloat. She simply held the space, firm, steady, and unwilling to retreat. Because this moment wasn't about who was right. It was about who had been left out. For a moment, the silence between them hung heavy. Then Justice Kagan straightened in her chair, lifted her chin, and did what she had done for most of her life: defend the institution she had helped shape. Her voice came low, deliberate, like a professor stepping back behind the lectern, retreating to the safety of syllogisms and case law. "Congresswoman Crockett," she began, tone even but tinged with something colder. "With all due respect, my decision was not a statement against the military itself, but a constitutional response to a discriminatory policy." The room didn't move. Her words didn't echo. They landed, precise, hardened, measured for impact. Her hands, carefully folded on the polished mahogany desk, remained still, as if motion might betray a crack in the marble logic she was constructing. "I believed," she continued, eyes locked forward, "that as Dean of Harvard Law, it was my obligation to uphold the moral framework of the institution I represented. Don't ask, don't tell violated basic equal protection principles. It excluded brave Americans based solely on their identity. And Harvard, as a private institution, had both the right and the duty to resist that." She paused, not for effect, but for structure. This was legal scaffolding, brick by brick, article by article. "Academic freedom," she said firmly, "is a cornerstone of constitutional interpretation. The university was not obliged to endorse policies that ran counter to its own anti-discrimination codes. It was all there: the conviction, the citations, the carefully carved wall of precedent that had made Kagan a pillar of liberal jurisprudence. But outside that wall, outside that smooth, symmetrical defense, something else lingered: absence." Jasmine didn't move. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. Because in the stillness that followed Kagan's argument, the silence screamed. For all the brilliance, all the constitutional architecture, not once had the justice said the word student. Not once had she spoken of the real, breathing people whose access to a life-changing opportunity had vanished. Not due to their identity, but due to their economic condition. Kagan had defended Harvard. She had defended principles, but she had not defended them. What stood out wasn't the strength of her answer. It was what had been omitted. The Constitution had become a kind of shield. An elegant one, yes, but a shield nonetheless. A way to insulate decisions that felt moral at the top from their human consequences at the bottom. It was a familiar structure to Crockett, one she had seen used before to justify redlining, voter ID laws, and sentencing disparities. "We followed the law," they always said. But whose law? And at what cost? As Kagan's final words settled over the chamber like polished stone, Jasmine finally looked up. Her fingers slowly unclasped. The fire hadn't gone out. It had just been waiting, patiently, precisely, for the moment to speak again. But where Kagan built her defense from constitutional heights, Crockett answered from ground level, where people lived, struggled, and paid the price for policies written far above them. Jasmine leaned in, not for theatrics, but because every inch closer carried the weight of 1,000 unheard voices. Her voice, low but unflinching, sliced through the polished air like steel drawn in the slow motion. "Justice," she said. "Just because something is principled doesn't make it righteous." Then she paused, letting the next words fall like iron. "Principle does not mean just when the powerless bear the cost of your ideals." The silence that followed wasn't polite. It was raw. Kagan's eyes narrowed slightly, her fingers flexing just once. But Jasmine wasn't finished. Her voice steadied, tightened like a drawstring. "Your intention may have been noble, but the outcome, it denied a pathway to those who couldn't afford alternatives." That wasn't an institutional protest. That was a human consequence. The tension in the room reached ignition. Phones in press rows lit up like wildfire. Journalists live tweeting every syllable. Political analysts scrambling to shift narratives mid-broadcast. On cable news tickers, phrases like "Crockett confronts Kagan, injustice under fire" for Harvard-era ethics began crawling across screens. Outside the chamber, crowds started to gather. Protesters, veterans, students, parents holding up signs that read, "Harvard closed the door." Who paid the price? The hearing had ceased being just about law. It had become something far more dangerous for those in power. A moral referendum. Inside, Kagan adjusted her microphone slightly, but she didn't speak. Crockett's challenge had not only pierced her defense, it had exposed something far more difficult to counter. A lived reality. And Jasmine knew it. She hadn't come to play punditry. She had come to measure the distance between the ideals etched into marble and the pain carved into real lives. And in that moment, for all her age, all her rank, and all her robes, Kagan was the one on defense. But Crockett wasn't done, because principles without memory are just theory, and she came armed with receipts carved not in argument, but in lived experience. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't stand. She simply nodded once toward the technician behind her, and within seconds, the screen at the back of the hearing chamber flickered to life. The lights dimmed, not entirely, but just enough for the tension to sharpen. The grainy footage began rolling. Time-stamped October 2005, outside the steps of Harvard Law School. A group of students, mostly black and brown, stood clustered beneath umbrellas, their handwritten signs blurred by the drizzle. "We serve too," one read. Another said, "Don't cancel my future." Their voices were low, almost drowned out by the wind, but unmistakable in purpose. These weren't radicals, they were students, future lawyers, and they were pleading not for a political statement, but for a chance to access the same military recruiters offered to their wealthier, whiter peers at other schools. There was no shouting, no chants, just one voice from the video, shaking but firm, calling out, "We don't want to fight your culture war. We just want to serve." As the video faded, Crockett didn't look at Kagan. She simply tapped her tablet again, and this time it was live. The screen filled with the face of a man in his early 40s. He sat at a modest kitchen table, clean but worn, a coffee mug beside him untouched. Gray traced his beard, but his eyes held steady. "I was one of them," he said. No introduction, no pause. "Harvard was a dream I could barely afford, and the Army was my way to keep it alive." His voice wasn't rehearsed. It carried the wear of truth, unpolished, unprotected. Then came the ban. Just like that, my ROTC scholarship vanished. I didn't get a round table. I didn't get to resist anything. He looked straight into the lens, like he was looking through the hearing room and into the soul of the system itself. "I wasn't trying to make a statement. I was trying to survive." A quiet swallowed the chamber. Every camera in the room locked onto the screen, but no one dared blink. Then came the words that shattered the last pretense of detachment. "I didn't choose politics. I chose to live, and Harvard chose for me." There was no reaction, only stillness. Kagan's lips pressed slightly together, her posture suddenly less composed. She didn't reach for her microphone. She didn't write a note. For the first time in the hearing, she looked unsure. Not because her logic had failed, but because her humanity had been cornered. Jasmine Crockett, sitting motionless across from her, didn't need to say a word. The man on the screen had already done what no congressional testimony could. He'd turned consequence into confession. The chairman shifted in his seat. His voice broke the silence, but barely. "Next question. Congresswoman Crockett. It was procedural, mechanical, because in truth, everyone in that room understood. A question had already been answered. The video disappeared from the screen, but its presence lingered, like smoke after a fire that refused to die. You could feel it in the way the staffers stopped typing, in the way a camera operator slowly lowered his lens. The room hadn't just been moved, it had been shifted. And as the silence curdled into discomfort, Jasmine Crockett leaned forward again, not with aggression, but with the devastating patience of someone who knew exactly what she was about to do. She spoke quietly, but every syllable landed with precision. Back then, you didn't apologize. It wasn't a condemnation. It was a statement of record, undeniable and inescapable. Crockett's voice held no tremble. Her gaze didn't waver. She was no longer debating legal theory. She was holding a mirror and daring the justice to look. The tension wasn't just between two women anymore. It was between two versions of America, one built on polished precedent, the other on the fractured ground of those who were never asked to testify. Crockett didn't blink. So let me ask you plainly, Justice. Here today, in front of the American people, do you have the courage to do it now? The question didn't shout. It pierced. Its power came not from volume, but from what it stripped away. The distance, the layers of abstraction, the comfortable shield of process. Kagan, who had handled senators, journalists, and law students with ease over a storied career, suddenly looked, as if for the first time, vulnerable. Her mouth parted slightly, her fingers shifted, but no words came, because the demand wasn't procedural, it was moral. And morality, unlike the law, doesn't wait for deliberation. Behind Jasmine, the stillness of the room took on a new density. People weren't just waiting to hear an answer. They were watching to see if the law itself, represented in flesh and fabric at that table, could admit it had ever gotten something wrong. Jasmine didn't need to elaborate. The question had already torn through the silence like thunder over dry land. This wasn't about punishment. It wasn't even about vindication. It was about whether power, when faced with pain it helped create, had the courage to say something simple. I'm sorry. But when the silence demanded an answer, Justice Kagan didn't meet it with humility. Instead, she reached for something colder, the safety of abstraction. She shifted in her seat, not dramatically, but just enough for trained eyes to recognize discomfort beneath decorum. Her posture remained composed, but her gaze momentarily dropped to the burnished surface of the hearing table, as if hoping to find a script carved into the grain. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the kind of poise that can only be cultivated over years behind lecture podiums and marble benches. This is not, she began deliberately, the forum to relitigate personal history or to cast judgment on decisions made under complex institutional pressures. Each word was carefully chosen, spoken not like a confession, but like a boundary. The cadence was practiced, the reasoning neat, measured for elegance rather than emotional weight. It was unmistakably the voice of a jurist attempting to close the door without making a sound. But Jasmine Crockett had come for the sound. She had come to make sure the door didn't close, not without the country hearing what was behind it. The Congresswoman sat perfectly still, her hands folded atop the file before her. Her silence didn't signal hesitation, it signaled focus. She let Kagan's words settle in the room like a soft fog, then pushed through it with the precision of a surgeon. But this is exactly the place to examine impact and to measure integrity. No theatrics, no raised voice, just a line sharpened by truth. One that cut through centuries of excuses dressed in constitutional language. One that rejected the comforting myth that intentions could ever be separated from consequences. Kagan looked back at her, eyes narrowing not in anger, but in recognition. Crockett had pierced through the procedural shell, and now the questions weren't about abstract legal theory. They were about people, about lives disrupted, dreams deferred, and doors shut under the weight of principled policy. The irony was almost unbearable. A decision made to protest exclusion had ended up excluding the very people most desperate for inclusion. And Crockett wouldn't let that be tidied away. The chamber fell into a thick, breathless silence. You could hear the distant hum of the overhead lights, the quiet rustling of paper as an aide shifted nervously behind the dais. The audience, which had been holding back whispers and coughs, now leaned into the quiet, because they sensed that something more than an argument was unfolding. This was a reckoning. Jasmine's gaze never left Kagan. Her tone remained steady, but underneath it pulsed something deeper, something that lived far beyond that room, the long memory of those who'd been denied opportunity and then told politely that it was nobody's fault, that it was just how systems worked, that Harvard had its reasons, that the courts had their rules, that some injustices were just the price of progress. Crockett's presence, her very existence in that chair, was a challenge to every version of that lie. And then, as if on cue, the system pushed back. A voice rang out from the far side of the room, loud, impatient, indignant. A congressman from the hard right flank of the committee slammed his palm against the desk, leaning forward like a man who'd been waiting to break the spell. "This is a show trial," he shouted, his voice booming off the paneled walls. "This committee's turning into a soapbox for leftist guilt trips." His words were more than outrage. They were desperation, an attempt to reclaim control of a narrative that was slipping away. His face was flushed, his gestures exaggerated for the cameras now circling the hearing, like vultures over fresh movement. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't blink. She didn't even glance his way. Her silence was louder than his outrage, and far more cutting, because she knew what was happening. This was fear, masked as fury. Fear that her calm had exposed something that could not be unspoken. Fear that moral clarity, when spoken by a black woman in a seat of power, could unravel decades of protective mythologies. The chairman, clearly irritated by the outburst, brought the gavel down with a sharp, deliberate crack that rang like a warning shot. "Order," he said, voice stern. "This is a hearing, not a circus. Sit down or be removed." The congressman scowled but obeyed, retreating back into his chair with the sullen energy of a man who'd lost the room. And he had, because for all the noise, all the posturing, the truth had already landed, and Jasmine hadn't raised her voice once. Kagan sat frozen, not in panic, but in something harder to name, a reckoning with unfinished responsibility. She had evoked complexity. She had pleaded institutional nuance, but Crockett had answered with something far more dangerous to power: clarity. And now clarity had cornered the conversation, not with vengeance, not with outrage, but with this unyielding fact. A choice was made, a cost was paid, and the person who paid it wasn't in the room when the decision was made. But just when the silence became unbearable, when neither apology nor denial filled the void, Jasmine Crockett reached for something no theory could outmaneuver: the record. The chamber darkened again, not by dimmed lights, but by the sudden shift in tone, the kind of tension that only comes when truth stops being philosophical and starts being documented. Jasmine tapped the tablet beside her with clinical finality. No preamble, no flair. A single PDF appeared on the hearing room monitors and live stream screens across the nation. Subject: Policy Concerns. Office of the Dean, Harvard Law, 2006. The timestamp alone was enough to make Kagan's shoulders tighten, but what followed would unravel the last line of her carefully defended position. The email was internal, never meant for public view, never meant for daylight. But here it was, years later, projected larger than life before a country that had, until that moment, believed the story was only about principle. Crockett read it aloud, her voice steady, impersonal, almost clinical. That made it worse. "We need to consider that continued access by military recruiters, even under protest, may damage our standing with peer institutions. There's a perception risk in letting soldiers march through our halls. It reads as an endorsement. It feels like a crude political statement made in uniform." A ripple of audible disbelief swept through the room. Even staffers behind the dais leaned in, eyes wide, jaws tensing. Jasmine paused, letting the final line settle like smoke from an explosion. "We cannot have servicemen parading through the halls as if they were some sort of crude political declaration." And just like that, it wasn't about policy anymore. It wasn't about institutional duty. It wasn't even about legal theory. It was about disdain, and not just for a policy, but for the people forced to wear it. Kagan's argument, once defended as moral resistance, now lay cracked open as something else: elite image management dressed up as ethics. Her effort to protect Harvard's moral compass had become indistinguishable from protecting its social currency among powerful allies in academia. And in doing so, she had reduced those who wore the uniform to nothing more than walking liabilities. The air inside the chamber dropped 10 degrees. You could feel it in your chest, the way it tightens before something explodes. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply looked up and said, her voice like steel drawn slowly from its sheath, "Not just black students," she let the words breathe, "but service itself was politicized by the elite." It wasn't a jab. It was an indictment, not of one person, but of an entire class who'd spent decades making decisions from behind sealed oak doors, while never facing the ripple effects in kitchens, bus stops, or recruiting offices. For the first time in 2 hours, Justice Elena Kagan flushed red. Not the soft blush of embarrassment, but the undeniable burn of being cornered, not by partisan rhetoric, but by her own archived logic. Her lips parted as if a rebuttal might form, but nothing came. Her eyes fell, not toward Jasmine, but somewhere inward. She knew the words. She had written them. She had forgotten they would outlive her explanation. The room sat breathless, not out of courtesy, but shock. Somewhere, a cough tried to escape from a staffer, but was muffled instantly. Reporters typed furiously, scrambling to keep up with a moment that had moved beyond analysis. Across the country, the live stream fractured the public down the middle. On Twitter, hashtags exploded: crude declaration, academic arrogance, who gets to serve justice versus judgment. Cable news anchors began talking over each other. Talk radio lit up with veterans calling in, their voices raw. "I didn't serve to be a prop," one said, "and I sure as hell didn't bleed so someone could call me a political inconvenience." Another, more subdued voice, choked but resolute, said, "I lost my scholarship in 2006. I remember that email." Not the words, but the tone. It always felt like we were an embarrassment they were trying to clean off the carpet. Meanwhile, in the chamber, Kagan remained frozen. The architecture of her defense, academic freedom, institutional conscience, constitutional loyalty, lay in ruins before the simple, brutal clarity of what her words had revealed: that protecting Harvard's reputation had come at the cost of human dignity. The very people she'd claimed to protect by protesting "don't ask, don't tell" had never been allowed into the equation in the first place. They weren't just collateral, they were invisible. Crockett didn't move. She had no need to speak further. Sometimes silence isn't surrender, it's sentencing. And in that silence, Kagan sat alone, surrounded not by critics, but by her own paper trail. Every sentence she'd written in that email now read differently. Every justification she'd built now felt more like a veil than a shield. Outside the Capitol, veterans gathered, some angry, some silent, all watching. Inside, the chairman of the hearing gave a glance that wasn't just procedural. It was personal. His father had served. So had his brother. And now even he looked shaken. The real question had changed. It was no longer, did Kagan mean well? It had become, at what point does intent collapse beneath consequence? In that moment, Jasmine Crockett didn't just win an argument. She unveiled a paradigm. She didn't tear down a person. She revealed a pattern, the way elite morality often conceals elitist control, the way resistance, when selective, can become its own form of oppression, the way words matter, not because they're elegant, but because they echo long after power forgets them. And Kagan, still silent, still flushed, still caught between past ambition and present consequence, had no rebuttal, because this time, the judgment wasn't hers to deliver. It was already being rendered by a nation that had just watched the robe slip. For a moment, it seemed Justice Kagan might remain silent, until she lifted her eyes, sharpened her tone, and responded not with regret, but with defiance. Her voice came not from the bench, but from somewhere deeper, older, worn not by years, but by convictions carved in decades of battle within elite institutions. "I do not apologize for trying to protect the gay and lesbian students who were being excluded. The words rang across the chamber, tight and forceful. It wasn't a performance. It was an assertion. Not of innocence, but of moral clarity. Her shoulders squared slightly as if drawing from the same posture she had used years ago, defending the right to protest with the weight of Harvard law behind her. What I did, she continued, I did because exclusion was being codified, and I refused to let my school be part of that injustice. For a beat, even the cameras hesitated. A nation leaned forward, some to cheer, some to clench fists, because for all her distance, all her institutional polish, there was no denying the sincerity in Kagan's voice. She had made that choice not to posture, but to protect. And yet the fire in her voice only made the next moment more painful. Jasmine Crockett didn't interrupt. She waited, let the words settle. Then she nodded, not with approval, but with recognition. You did the right thing, just not for everyone. Her voice, quieter now, carried something heavier than challenge. Grief. Because what she said next wasn't a rebuttal. It was a mirror. A reminder that justice, when it only shields some, leaves others bleeding beneath it. You defended one community by closing the door on another. No one's questioning your heart, Justice, but hearts don't erase harm. There it was. Two women, two truths, two wounds, both real. One forged in the Ivy halls where identity was erased in silence. The other born in neighborhoods where uniforms were the only scholarship application that didn't ask for legacy or donations. And now in this hearing, they stood on opposite sides of a line neither of them had drawn, but both had learned to survive. The tension in the chamber stopped being political. It became generational. Two versions of courage were colliding, one shaped by faculty lounges and social policy memos, the other by court dockets and concrete. Kagan represented a world where battles were fought with language, precedent, and access. Crockett came from a world where people fought just to be seen at all. Outside, headlines began to fragment the moment. Kagan holds line on moral ground. Crockett calls out partial justice. Who gets to be protected? But inside, the next sentence brought the clash to a boil. Crockett didn't blink. She didn't soften. She knew where this was headed, and she aimed her words like a scalpel. Then let me ask you this. Do you support legislation that would require the United States Supreme Court to adopt a binding code of ethics? There it was, a question that couldn't hide behind history or Harvard or heroism. Because in that moment, the issue wasn't just what had happened, it was what came next. Accountability, transparency, standards, not just for her, for all of them. The chamber flinched. You could feel it, like a collective intake of breath that no one wanted to release too loudly. Because everyone in that room knew what the question meant. It was no longer about a single decision or an email or a long-forgotten memo. This was systemic. This was Crockett, pulling the conversation out of memory and into law. Kagan sat still, her face unreadable. But the pause was long, measured. Behind her, aides shifted nervously. One tapped their notes, another whispered toward legal counsel. But none of that mattered anymore. Because the question wasn't a trap, it was a litmus test. And not just for Kagan, it was for every justice who had ever made decisions insulated from consequence. For every robe that had never been required to explain a conflict of interest. For every ruling shaped in private, never examined in public. And suddenly it didn't matter that Kagan had once tried to protect students, or that Crockett had exposed an old email. Because this moment, the collision of two women shaped by different fires, was about something larger. What power does with its immunity. The cameras zoomed in, not on their faces, on their stillness. Because when the stakes are highest, stillness is where history breathes. And the nation, watching, judging, hoping, waited for what would come next. The question hovered in the chamber like smoke from a just-fired shot. And when Justice Kagan finally answered, it wasn't with certainty, but calculation. She didn't rush. She never did. Elena Kagan had spent decades mastering the art of waiting, letting silence do the work of persuasion until she could shape the terms herself. But now in this room, electrified with consequence, even her practiced calm trembled at the edges. Her lips parted, closed again, and then finally, it's a complicated issue. The words landed with the weight of retreat. The independence of the judiciary is a foundational principle. Any legislation that impacts how justices conduct themselves must be considered carefully to preserve that independence. Her voice wasn't defiant this time. It was measured, but not in the way a surgeon measures distance. It was the kind of measurement that tries to find balance where balance no longer exists. She spoke like someone trying to walk a tightrope stretched between two crumbling towers. Public trust and institutional ego. Her gaze was steady, but something behind her eyes had shifted, not because she lacked conviction, but because for the first time, her conviction wasn't enough. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't sigh or sneer or shake her head. She just watched, listened, and when Kagan finished, she allowed the silence to linger, not to punish, but to make space for something deeper than disappointment. She wasn't surprised. She was resolved. Then in a voice so grounded it cut through every echo in the room, Crockett spoke. The American people are not asking for perfection. They are asking for the courage to be accountable. The sentence didn't rise in pitch. It didn't crescendo. It settled, with a finality that was louder than any closing argument. Every syllable felt earned. Every pause felt like a pulse. It wasn't rhetoric. It was release. You could feel the chamber react, not loudly, but physiologically. A held breath, a stilled hand, a shared awareness that something irreversible had just been said. In 9 words, Jasmine had redefined the entire hearing. It was no longer about an email, or a policy, or even a single justice. It was about a system so consumed with protecting its image that it had forgotten its purpose. And then slowly, inevitably, the room broke apart. It started with a murmur. One staffer stood quietly, clapping once, then again. A senator followed, then another, but not all. Half the room rose in applause, their expressions solemn, not triumphant, clapping not for victory, but for truth spoken plainly. The other half stood too, but not for Crockett. They clapped for Kagan, for the weight she had carried, for the dignity she had maintained even as the ground beneath her shifted. It was surreal. 2 standing ovations, pointed in opposite directions. One room, one system. One fracture made visible. Reporters scrambled to capture it. Headline writers salivated. The Great Divide. Crockett and Kagan split the nation in one sentence. Perfection versus accountability. Which America do you serve? Outside the building, crowds erupted, some in chants of support for judicial reform, others holding signs defending judicial independence. On the steps of the Capitol, 2 young Marines stood shoulder to shoulder, watching the feed on a phone. One wiped away a tear. The other simply whispered, "Finally." But inside, Jasmine remained seated. Her job wasn't to win, it was to reveal, and she had. Kagan didn't respond further. She didn't need to. Her silence now was not evasive. It was contemplative. She had been challenged not by hostility, but by clarity. And clarity, once spoken, doesn't leave quietly. As the gavel struck to close the session, the chamber didn't exhale. It reverberated. Because in that final moment, amid applause that meant 2 different things to 2 different sides, something undeniable had occurred. The untouchable had been touched. The protected had been questioned. And the system, for one brief, blinding second, had looked at itself. The gavel had fallen, but the battle was just beginning. Because outside the hearing room, the echoes of that final exchange ignited a national firestorm no one could contain. Within hours, the country fractured along new lines, ones that didn't neatly follow party, class, or coast. Veterans, scholars, Ivy League alumni, civil rights advocates, and LGBTQ+ leaders found themselves standing on opposite sides of a moral chasm, each claiming the same language, justice, dignity, courage, but meaning something entirely different. On cable news, talking heads clashed over the hearing's fallout with the intensity of a national security breach. MSNBC aired split screens. On one side, a Marine sergeant with tears in his eyes calling Crockett the voice we've been waiting for. On the other, a Harvard law professor defending Kagan's legacy as a principled stance taken in a time of moral crisis. CNN's Kyron read, "Can ethics choose its victims?" Social media became a war zone. Veterans organizations posted statements, some in praise of Crockett for finally giving voice to their silent frustration, others standing behind Kagan, insisting her intent had been just. The American Legion released a carefully worded statement supporting a full conversation on the unintended consequences of elite resistance, while a more progressive group, Vote Vets, tweeted bluntly, "If our uniforms are political statements, why did they send us to fight for a flag?" At Harvard, protests erupted across the campus lawn. Students held signs reading, "Justice must see us all," while a counter-demonstration formed across the quad. Intentions matter too. One side saw Kagan's private email as damning evidence of systemic elitism. The other viewed it as the messy, imperfect calculus of a leader trying to push back against a discriminatory policy. And caught between them stood the administration, tight-lipped, hedging statements, unsure which version of righteousness would survive the decade. Even within the LQB plus community, fault lines emerged. Activists who had long praised Kagan's courage found themselves questioned by queer veterans who felt unseen. On a viral live stream, a gay former Navy corpsman named Ricardo Vélez broke down in front of a crowd of thousands. "I'm proud of what she tried to do," he said, "but I'm tired of being part of someone else's protest. I served. I bled. I don't want to be a pawn in anyone's politics, not even progressive ones." His words echoed across communities, complicating the narrative that had once been simple. Who was the oppressor and who was the oppressed? Academic circles lit up like wildfire. Law review articles were drafted overnight, attempting to dissect the constitutional ramifications of Crockett's proposal for an ethics code. Some hailed it as a necessary recalibration of judicial authority. Others warned it would politicize the court irreparably. But for the first time in decades, the Supreme Court itself was on trial. Not in law, but in the court of public trust. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett became both lightning rod and lighthouse. She appeared on PBS, calm and composed, reiterating her message. This was never about one email. It was about how power justifies impact through language and who gets erased in that calculation. Her words were clipped, reshared, and quoted from morning shows to podcasts. On The Daily, host Michael Barbaro asked, "Has the age of judicial untouchability finally ended?" And from the floor of the House, a Republican lawmaker fumed that Crockett had single-handedly shattered the last institution Americans still trusted. But behind the headlines, the personal cost was real. Crockett's office received threats. Staffers were forced to reroute routines. Protesters gathered outside her Texas district office, some waving flags in support, others shouting her name like a curse. And yet she never flinched. In a moment captured by a local reporter, she was seen leaving the building after midnight, briefcase in one hand, a folded American flag, gifted by a veteran who had watched the hearing, in the other. Still, the deepest shockwaves weren't on television or Twitter. They were in living rooms, school campuses, and base housing across the country. Fathers who served sat across from daughters studying law. Spouses of LGBTQ plus service members debated what allyship meant when it came at the expense of other vulnerable groups. College classrooms erupted with debates that spilled out onto sidewalks, and everywhere the same haunting question lingered like smoke after gunfire. Can justice exclude and still be called justice? It wasn't just a policy question anymore. It had become a test of national conscience. One email, one sentence, one woman's question had detonated years of carefully compartmentalized truths. And now the country was being forced to look, really look, at how it chose who to protect. Not everyone agreed on the answer, but no one could deny that the question had finally been asked. But when a question rattles the conscience of a nation, it doesn't just echo, it compels action. And in Washington, that echo found its way into the halls of the Senate. Within 72 hours of the hearing's close, something happened that hadn't occurred in over 2 centuries of American governance. The Senate Judiciary Committee convened to discuss drafting an enforceable code of ethics for the United States Supreme Court. No leaks, no vague resolutions, no symbolic gestures tucked into appropriations bills. This was different, real, urgent. The highest court in the land, long insulated by tradition, reverence, and opacity, was now facing the first serious challenge to its self-governing status in U.S. history. The atmosphere inside the Senate was electric, and not in a celebratory way. It was the electricity of storms brewing, of tectonic plates shifting beneath institutions that had, until now, moved only when they chose to. Cameras weren't just outside the hearing room. They were embedded in every hallway, every elevator, every Senate briefing room. Journalists whispered like intelligence agents. Lobbyists swarmed in silence. Allies became cautious. And behind it all was a single demand, now impossible to ignore. If every judge in America is bound by a code, why not the 9 who wield the greatest power? The proposed legislation moved faster than anyone expected. Staffers burned through legal precedent in comparative judicial systems from around the world. France, Canada, Israel, nations where even constitutional courts had mandatory ethical frameworks. Draft titles appeared on C-SPAN screens: the Supreme Court Transparency and Accountability Act, the Judicial Integrity Code of 2025, Crockett Klobuchar, Amendment, Section 3, Disclosures and Recusals Mandate. And through every draft, one name sat at the top of the movement like a lightning rod: Jasmine Crockett. Her words, "People aren't asking for perfection, they're asking for courage to be accountable," had become more than a quote. They were now the preamble of a revolution in judicial ethics. But behind the legislative theater, tensions cracked through the political foundation like pressure beneath marble. Opponents of the bill framed it as an assault on judicial independence. Senate Minority Leader James Redfield went live on FOX News, face stern, voice like gravel. "What Representative Crockett is proposing," he warned, "is a politicization of the Supreme Court so extreme it would make Madison weep in his grave." His words were clipped and calibrated, but they couldn't erase the fact that polling numbers were shifting fast. A recent Pew survey showed 67% of Americans now supported mandatory ethical oversight for Supreme Court justices. Even among conservatives, the number was over 50%. Back in the Judiciary Committee room, the hearings turned volatile. Senators clashed with scholars. Legal experts clashed with clerks. Witnesses from across the ideological spectrum testified, some in robes, others in fatigues. One retired Army colonel, now a Harvard Law alum, delivered the line that broke the room wide open. "The people I served with bled for rules. You want to tell me the people in robes shouldn't live by any?" It wasn't just dramatic, it was undeniable. Still, resistance came hard and fast. Anonymous op-eds flooded the Wall Street Journal, claiming the legislation would open floodgates for political vendettas. Conservative PACs launched ads painting the bill as a judicial leash that would shatter the wall between law and mob rule. One spot even manipulated Jasmine Crockett's voice into a soundbite, cutting her phrase, "elite systems must be questioned," over images of burning flags. It was ugly, and it was only getting worse. Crockett, meanwhile, stood in the center of the storm, not untouched, but unmoved. She appeared before the Senate as the bill's co-sponsor, standing beside longtime reform advocate Senator Amy Klobuchar. Dressed in navy blue, voice calm, she addressed the room not as a firebrand, but as a witness. "This is not revenge," she said. "It is responsibility. This is not about left or right. It's about whether we believe that power should be protected or examined." Her presence froze the chamber. For once there were no phones, no coughs, no rustling papers. Just the quiet, reverent sound of a body politic holding its breath. And then something no one expected happened. A Republican senator, veteran, former judge, lifelong skeptic of judicial reform, stood and said, "She's right." The quote made every network. The markets wobbled. Judicial insiders panicked. But the public rallied. It wasn't just about one law. It was about one question that had gone unanswered for too long. When the law looks into the mirror, who decides if it still recognizes itself? Across the country, law students marched. Retired judges wrote open letters. Military veterans posted videos online, saluting and saying, "Justice has no rank, but it should have rules." The ground was moving, not fast, but undeniably. For the first time in American history, the Supreme Court's greatest shield, the myth of moral infallibility, had been pierced not by scandal, but by truth calmly spoken under oath. And as the final draft of the ethics bill was read aloud in the Senate subcommittee room, no one missed the detail printed quietly at the bottom. Inspired by testimony delivered on March 3, 2025. Committee hearing, Crockett versus Kagan. The law was changing, and it had a name. But even as legislation advanced and the country erupted in debate, one voice had remained notably absent until Justice Elena Kagan finally stepped forward and with just 7 words reignited the fire. It came not from a press conference nor a Senate floor, but in a carefully orchestrated moment inside the East Reading Room of the Supreme Court, a rare, almost sacred space where justices rarely speak and never about themselves. But this time, under the silent gaze of oil-painted predecessors and with the weight of an institution pressed upon her shoulders, Justice Kagan delivered a statement the nation had been waiting for. Her voice was low, devoid of defiance, but neither was it apologetic. "I don't regret what I did, but I hear you." 7 words, not an admission, not a reversal, but not a dismissal either. The line struck the air with a strange softness, measured, careful, unmistakably designed to both acknowledge and contain. "I don't regret, but I hear you." It was the language of someone caught between legacy and revelation, someone trying to thread the impossible needle, holding her ground without erasing those left on the outside of her choices. Within minutes, the statement was everywhere. CNN interrupted programming, NPR played it on loop. The New York Times called it a moment of tempered introspection. The Atlantic asked whether it was enough in the age of moral transparency. Opinion writers fractured down predictable lines, some calling the comment a graceful balancing act, others branding it hollow neutrality in the face of a national reckoning. But on CNN's primetime interview, Jasmine Crockett didn't hesitate. Seated across from veteran anchor Aaron Dorsey, her face calm but resolute, she responded not with outrage, but with the piercing elegance of someone who understood exactly what the moment required. "Hearing is the first step," she said. Then a pause, a breath. Her eyes didn't flinch as the camera zoomed in. "But change is the only reply that matters." The sentence hit harder than a dozen viral monologues. It wasn't loud. It was inevitable. A truth delivered with the clarity of someone who had lived too long in the shadow of well-meaning gestures. Crockett didn't attack Kagan. She didn't question her integrity. Instead, she held the spotlight on a harder truth. That acknowledgement without action is just another form of preservation. The clip went viral within seconds. Hashtags reignited. Honor Hearist trended alongside Namr Now Act. Veterans tweeted it. Civil rights groups reposted it. Even LGBTQ+ organizations, still navigating their own fault lines, echoed the call. Hearing is not healing. Silence was never the only wound. In barbershops and boardrooms, the question shifted once again. Not did Kagan mean well, but was meaning well ever enough? Inside judicial circles, Kagan's comment divided clerks and colleagues alike. Some admired her restraint. Others saw it as a last defense of a system unwilling to confront the full scope of its elitism. A retired appellate judge, speaking anonymously, confessed to the Washington Post, "It was a masterclass in institutional survival, but I'm not sure the institution deserves to survive untouched." Crockett, meanwhile, kept moving. Not with bravado, but momentum. She didn't seek victory laps. She refused appearances on late-night shows. "This isn't entertainment," she told her staff. "This is a turning point, or it's nothing." Her words echoed from the screen not as sound bites, but as strategy. She knew what the public wanted. Not contrition, but commitment. Still, the cost was real. In one viral clip, a protester confronted Crockett outside a university panel, accusing her of dividing the left. "You made her look like a villain," they screamed. Crockett didn't respond. She just nodded once, as if carrying something heavier than anyone in the crowd could see. Because she wasn't dividing the movement. She was revealing its blind spots. And across the nation, people began facing hard truths. Truths about how institutions protect ideals while ignoring casualties, about how progress is too often defined by who gets to speak, not who gets heard. Conversations that had long been hushed in faculty lounges and VFW halls now erupted across dinner tables and online threads. And through it all, those 7 words from Kagan hung in the air like unfinished poetry. I don't regret, but I hear you. And Jasmine's reply, steady and searing, had become the line that followed it forever. Hearing is the first step, but change is the only reply that matters. 2 sentences, 1 moment, a nation holding its breath to see which would echo louder. But time, like truth, has a rhythm of its own. And as the months passed, the tremors of one hearing rippled outward, reshaping the very ground American justice stood on. 1 year later, the marble columns of Capitol Hill bore witness to something unseen in 2 centuries of judicial history. A binding, bipartisan law passed with full Senate approval, forcing the United States Supreme Court to operate under a formal code of ethics. No longer could justices shield financial entanglements under vague disclosures. No longer could trips, gifts, private speaking engagements, or university affiliations be brushed aside as ceremonial. Every financial tie, every educational arrangement, every potential conflict of interest now had to be declared, logged, and made visible to the American people. The bill, named the Judicial Accountability and Transparency Act of 2026, passed in a 67-33 vote, barely filibuster-proof, yet undeniable in its mandate. The final roll call was televised live to 8.6 million viewers. Veterans stood in salute outside courthouses from Atlanta to Seattle. Law students watched from lecture halls, erupting in cheers not for political victory, but for the restoration of something more fundamental: trust. And as the Speaker of the House signed the bill beneath a portrait of Thurgood Marshall, the room didn't celebrate. It exhaled. Because for once, the people had pushed the system to look inward, and the system had blinked. Inside the chamber, Jasmine Crockett was present, but seated quietly, away from cameras, away from podiums. She had turned down interviews that day. She didn't walk the carpeted steps to the press gallery. She had no desire to turn the law into a spotlight. Her team had urged her to consider the next move. Senate buzz was growing louder. "You have the votes," they said. "You've become the conscience of the Hill." Her inbox was flooded with endorsements. Op-eds titled "Senator Crockett" appeared in every major outlet. But she declined. With just 3 sentences, she ended the speculation. "I'm not here to rise, I'm here to hold the line. We don't need more ambition in the upper chamber. We need someone standing guard where the people still walk." She chose to stay in the House of Representatives, the place closest to the people. She turned down a promotion in order to remain what she called the last check on unchecked power. Her office stayed open late, her staff the same. In private, she told them, "Let others debate legacy. I'll worry about impact." And that, perhaps more than any law, became the shift. She didn't chase the title. She became something rarer, a symbol that did not seek the crown, but the mirror. Meanwhile, Justice Elena Kagan remained on the court, her robes intact, her gavel untouched. But something beneath the surface had changed. Where once she spoke freely at legal forums and academic panels, now she declined invitations. Her public remarks grew sparse, her writing tighter. She gave no commencement speeches that spring. For the first time in her tenure, she withdrew from the Aspen Ideas Festival without explanation. Those close to her said she had become more inward. Clerks noticed her pacing more before oral arguments. Her questions on the bench still carried precision, but less flourish. No editorials, no interviews. Not silence from shame, but from introspection. Because whether she admitted it or not, Crockett had carved a space in her conscience, and it had changed the way Kagan saw her legacy. Not as a monument, but as a mosaic, now missing pieces she had never known she'd left behind. They never became friends. They never hugged for cameras or posed for unity. But they did something far more radical. They forced each other to look inward, and in doing so, they forced a nation to do the same. Across America, new conversations began, not on Capitol floors, but in kitchens, classrooms, churches, and veteran halls. Harvard Law revised its recruitment policy language to acknowledge past exclusions rooted in reputation over representation. The Department of Justice created a rotating ethics board for federal appointments modeled after Crockett's proposal. Law schools began offering full credit coursework on institutional accountability and legal bias, not performatively, systemically. But beyond policy shifts and think pieces, the most profound change was cultural. The myth of infallibility had cracked, and what replaced it was something closer to truth. It wasn't cleaner, it wasn't easier, but it was real. Crockett walked through the Capitol one evening as dusk fell over the rotunda. She passed staffers she didn't know. Some nodded, some stopped her. One young intern, a first-generation law student, held out a copy of the Code of Ethics and asked her to sign it. Crockett paused, smiled, and instead wrote, "Accountability isn't something we demand. It's something we live." Outside, lightning flared over the horizon, casting sharp silhouettes against the dome. The storm hadn't passed. It had just begun to move through the right places. And as two women returned to their lives, one cloaked in quiet robes, the other holding the line in a crowded house chamber, America did not forget them. Not as rivals, not as ideologues, but as two reflections of a country still learning how to define justice, not by who it serves, but by who it refuses to ignore. And as the echoes of reform settled into the bones of the system, what remained wasn't the clash between Crockett and Kagan. It was the space they carved for a deeper question. What does justice mean when it forgets the people it was built to protect? Justice, we are taught, is blind. But blindness, when left unexamined, can become indifference. And in the hollow between Kagan's silence and Crockett's demand, America was forced to confront a truth more uncomfortable than corruption or partisanship, that even the purest intentions, when carried out from towers too high, can crush those struggling below. It wasn't malice that had locked the doors on opportunity. It was the subtle, insidious belief that some costs were acceptable, as long as they belonged to someone else. Crockett never asked the court to crumble. She never called for resignation. What she demanded was far more dangerous: clarity. She demanded that those in power look at the trail of damage left by decisions they swore were noble. She demanded that dignity no longer be selective, that moral conviction be measured not by how high it stood, but by who it bent down to lift. Her fight wasn't against one woman. It was against a system that had learned to confuse intellectual distance with ethical high ground. She had stepped into that hearing knowing exactly what it would cost: the backlash, the character attacks, the accusations of dividing progressives or exploiting service. But she bore it with the precision of someone raised to understand that truth, spoken plainly, always comes at a price. What she stood for was not perfection, it was moral courage. And moral courage is lonely. It doesn't win popularity contests, it wins clarity. The lesson she left in that room and in the hearts of millions wasn't about law. It was about responsibility, the kind that doesn't get applause, the kind that shows up when the cameras are off and the victims can't vote. She reminded America that ethical leadership is not measured by how eloquently someone defends their record, but by how quickly they acknowledge who got left behind in the process. And what about Kagan? She did not fall. She did not shatter, but she changed. And that change, quiet, cautious, incomplete, was itself a moral teaching. It showed that even the most revered figures can still be students of consequence, that being brilliant does not shield anyone from the responsibility to listen, and that silence, when held too long, becomes a wall. But sometimes even the act of hearing begins to carve a door. Together, without shaking hands, without writing joint op-eds, without forgiveness or photo ops, Crockett and Kagan left a legacy of friction, and from that friction came fire. Not a fire that destroyed, but one that illuminated. The quiet faces left out of progressive victories. The veterans seen as liabilities. The students treated as statistics. The communities judged by how disruptive their truth was to the comfort of institutions. In that hearing, America saw something rare. Two women who had fought for justice all their lives collide over the question of whose pain is worth acknowledging. And from that collision came not closure, but reckoning. The human lesson? It is this: justice without self-reflection is just ritual. Power without accountability is just performance. And silence, when worn like armor, eventually cuts the people it's meant to protect. Crockett reminded us that the role of a public servant is not to ascend, but to hold the door open from below, that no title, no robe, no tenure should ever excuse someone from asking, "Who did we forget?" She reminded us that courage isn't in the strike. It's in the stillness afterward, when you look at the damage and ask if you could have done better. And Kagan? She taught a different lesson, just as vital, that it's not weakness to be questioned, that even the mightiest have blind spots, and that integrity is not the refusal to change, but the willingness to sit in discomfort long enough to grow. In classrooms now, they teach that hearing. In law schools, they dissect the exchange not as a political showdown, but as a moral turning point. Professors quote, "Not the rulings, but the questions." And in military academies, cadets read Crockett's line, "People don't ask for perfection. They ask for the courage to be accountable," and write essays on what it means to wear a uniform and be seen as more than a symbol. That is the measure of what was won, not a vote, not a law, not a name on a bill, but a shift in national vocabulary. We no longer ask, "Was it constitutional?" We now ask, "Was it just?" We no longer ask, "Was it defensible?" We now ask, "Who did it defend?" And in that evolution, in that fiery, gut-wrenching, uncomfortable expansion, America became something closer to the country it claims to be. Because Crockett didn't just confront a justice, she reminded the nation that justice isn't what we write into law. It's what we refuse to leave out. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.